Text, the workshop will begin shortly.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. This workshop will begin shortly. Before we begin, we wanted to run through a few quick housekeeping items with you. First, we want this to be very interactive. So we will have a very short presentation, and then the remaining opportunity is going to have breakout rooms where we're going to really allow you to engage with us and ask our experts. However, if you do have any questions during this first presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen or chat, and you can send us a message. We are offering closed captioning and Zoom technical support.
Closed captioning link bit.ly/3CHTGSF, Zoom technical support 1-888-799-9666 extension 2 or support.zoom.us/HC/EN-US.
You can see those links there and we will chat those out. We also want to be sure that we're listening to you. So we'll be interactive with you on this session. We also would really appreciate it if you would please go ahead and fill out the feedback form. We will chat this link so that you have that handy.
Feedback, please tell us what you thought of this webinar at bit.ly/3CL89FC.
We're hopeful that you'll not only consider this series that we're going to be talking about, but that you'll also join our community. Please consider following us on Twitter as well as LinkedIn.
Follow us on Twitter at NIASBIR. Follow us on LinkedIn NIA Office of Small Business Research.
And with that, we'll begin. Welcome to the NIA and NHLBI Entrepreneur Workshop Series, focused on opportunity assessment. We're joined by illustrious speakers, Dr. Don Rose from the National Institute on Aging, Dr. Renée Arnold from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, Luis Gutierrez from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and I'll serve as your moderator today.
Moderator, Monique LaRocque, M.Ph. Senior Vice President Ogilvy, F.K.H.
And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Rose.
Keynote Speaker, Don Rose, Ph.D. Entrepreneur in Residence, National Institute on Aging, National Institutes of Health.
Well, thank you very much, Monique, and welcome everyone. I'm excited to have everybody here for this really first in a series of entrepreneur workshops that we're putting on. Again, my name is Don Rose, and I'm your host for this series of workshops. As mentioned, these workshops are sponsored by NIH's National Institute on Aging and the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. So as you can see from the slides, we are actually running a series of workshops. This is the first of a series. This is going to be on opportunity assessment or opportunity evaluation.
Mark your calendar now for these upcoming workshops. Corporate Governance and Management, March 16th. Register today. Intellectual Property, April 27th. Licensing and Partnering Agreements, June 22nd. Stay tuned for future sessions, dates TBA. Competition and Differentiation, Regulatory Strategy, Pitching and Promoting the Company, Investment Funding 1, and Investment Funding 2.
Then we're going to run through a whole series of workshops that'll cover other topics, as you can see here, corporate governance, intellectual property licensing, and so on. And these workshops, the series has been designed to kind of cover the arc of development of a startup company from kind of first inception, things like opportunity assessment and incorporation, all the way through investment funding at the end. And so we encourage you to join these workshops. They'll be running, as you can see, these dates roughly every month or every other month as we plan these out.
Title, Workshop Format. Text, Welcome and Introductions.
So the format for this workshop and all subsequent workshops is going to be really a two-part workshop. The first is going to be a presentation, an overview of the topic. So we'd like to present the topic and have just a high-level presentation of the topic, either by myself or in this case myself, along with our other two panelists. And they're going to just present a little bit about the kind of the subtopic within this bigger topic. And then after that, we're going to go into these breakout rooms where we have a chance to do Q&A with the individual panelists. And you can see these breakout rooms are going to be where I'll be talking about market size, growth and competition. Luis will be talking about reimbursement strategy, and Renee will be talking about healthcare economics. So this will give you a chance to not only bring your questions that you have, but also dive a little bit deeper into any of these topics that you have an interest in. And you will be able to move between the different breakout rooms. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, what the mechanics are of that.
Title, Ideation to Commercialization.
So let's start with just this idea of, which you probably are all familiar with, of having some sort of novel science or technology that comes out of research. And then the commercialization of that usually goes through some process of creating a startup company, and then a series of product development steps, regulatory approval, things of that nature, until you're finally at the product. And I think everybody is fairly familiar with that process. But we want to take it a little bit differently. We want to start with the end in mind.
Text, begin with the end in mind. Stephen Covey.
And so what we really want to do is start with the product in mind and kind of work backwards by asking a number of questions about that. So with the product in mind, there are a number of questions that come up around, for example, the market. What is the unmet need? How large is the market? What is the competition? There are also questions about reimbursement. Who's going to pay for this product? How will you get paid? How much will you get paid? And there are a bunch of economic sort of value questions about the product. What economic value is being created? What are the incentives for adoption? Are the economic incentives aligned? Many of these questions don't get answered until later in the process. And we'd like to argue that these questions need to be addressed very early in the process. So why are we asking these questions? And why are we assessing these opportunities so early?
A cartoon of a young boy sitting at a desk with his mouth wide open. Text, this is a big, fat waste of my time.
One is that no one wants to waste their time working on things that don't have where there's no real opportunity. So we're assessing the opportunity. Is there a market? Is there a reimbursement strategy or is there reimbursement possible? Is there an economic benefit to this? So we want to ask those questions early so you're not wasting a lot of time. But more importantly, by answering these questions early, it'll give you a leg up on securing SBR awards, attracting investors, and establishing these partnerships. So these three areas we're going to be talking about: market research, or just market in general, competition, how to understand what the market is, health economics, and reimbursement. These are all related. There's lots of overlap between the three. So I'm going to first talk about markets and market research at a very high level, and then turn it over to my panelists who are going to talk about things in more detail. And again, after we go through these three very short presentations, then we'll go into breakout rooms where you'll have a chance to really dive a little bit deeper into each one of these.
Title, Common Pitfalls in Market Research.
For market research, there are a number of pitfalls that come from kind of assessing the market. There are a bunch of kind of, I'll call them rookie mistakes, not to be too negative here, but many people will say, well, if we just capture 1% of the market, we'll have X, millions or billions of dollars. And investors in general don't like those sort of comments. So just avoid that if you can. And of course, the real big one is there is no competition. There's always competition. It's just a matter of identifying it, whether it's direct competition or indirect competition, but there's always competition.
Text, failure to identify the true standards of care.
There are, of course, standards of care associated with a lot of medical innovations. And sometimes it's not always clear what the true standards of care for those innovations are, or for those medical treatments.
Failure to identify beachhead and follow-on markets.
There are, of course, markets you want to try to enter in, but if you don't identify, for example, what your beachhead market is and your follow-on markets, that can be difficult for a company. You can't necessarily jump into a market that's too large or that you're not prepared to get into. So many times it's important to identify what is that beachhead market that we're going to go after, and then what are the follow-on markets after that? Because if the market's just too big, it can be a problem for just a company to be able to assess it.
Not fully understanding the pain point of a customer.
Again, not understanding the real pain point of the customer. There are really 2 points here. First is understanding who the customer is. In the medical world, in the healthcare world, the customer can be multiple customers, but not really understanding their pain points. Some of their pain points are economic. Some of their pain points are quality of life, as in a patient. Some of their pain points are delivery of care from a doctor. So it's important to understand those. And Renee will probably talk a lot more about those sort of pain points among those different customers. And not understanding the full life cycle use case. So you can understand perhaps how your product is used in a very particular use case, but that may not be where it fits into or it may not have a full understanding of how it is in the entire use case. So for example, a medical device may solve a small problem, but you need to understand how does that medical device fit in the total use case of, say, an operation or a medical procedure. So understanding the kind of full life cycle use case is important as you think about kind of where does your product fit into the market. Again, back to that earlier comment about differentiating the different stakeholders. In any sort of situation, you have the influencer, the economic buyer, the person who's writing the check for whatever the product is, or in the users. The end users can be, doctors, patients, and so on. So it's important to understand and differentiating among those different stakeholders. And finally, really understanding the competitive analysis to fully differentiate your offering. I think that if there's probably one piece of advice I'd offer companies in trying to pitch their idea or at least get started, it's really what makes you different. What is differentiating both on a business model perspective, but also on a science perspective? I think that many of people know the science, but it's the business or business model that's the differentiator. So trying to differentiate yourself is super important, especially early on.
Text reimbursement strategy.
Okay, with that, I'd like to turn it over to Luis, who's going to talk to you about reimbursement strategy.
Thank you very much, Don.
Title, Common Pitfalls in Reimbursement Strategy.
So I'm gonna, and again, not to sway on the negative, but to the Don's point about rookie mistakes or common pitfalls, what often goes wrong, and I often see entrepreneurs make 3 mistakes. The first is assuming that FDA, or in Europe, EMA approval means payers will provide reimbursement. That's far from true, especially in the US market. It's 2 very separate processes with different audiences, different metrics. And so FDA approval is necessary, but not sufficient. In fact, often reimbursement is called the 4th hurdle. The first 3 hurdles, safety, efficacy, and manufacturing controls, are all done by the FDA. The 4th hurdle is reimbursement. It's another hurdle that comes after you've cleared the first 3. The second one is assuming that getting a code, meaning a billing code, is easy, fast, or in some cases even necessary. It's not that easy, it's not that fast, but the good news is it isn't always necessary depending on what setting of care, what kind of product you have, et cetera. There's a lot of detailed analysis that goes into how does the money flow. In many cases, that's mediated with codes, but not always. And then the final pitfall is failing to understand, and I think this echoes a lot of what Don had to say about really understanding your market, is understanding the economic incentives and or economic constraints that the users or the prescribers, and often those are 2 different parties of the product, you need to understand how they get paid. Because for most medical products, virtually all are a B2B sale, a business-to-business sale. Only a small minority of the technologies we fund at the NIH are actually sold directly to consumers. So when you've got an intermediary, you've got to understand how does that intermediary, how do they make money? Whether it's a hospital, a pharmacy, a doctor. In some cases, you've got multiple intermediaries. You've got a doctor writing in the prescription, a pharmacy fulfilling the prescription. And your sale only happens if there isn't some block up, along the way. So understanding your customer's value chain is very important. Go to the next slide, please.
Title, Key Questions to Address.
So the key questions to address in reimbursement strategy, and it is difficult early in development, is identifying who are the relevant payers for the population being targeted. In most ex-US markets, it's a little easier because there's one national payer that covers everybody. Here in the US, we have over 1,000 different health plans. But they're not all the same demographically. So depending on what patient populations you go after, your ratio of Medicare, Medicaid, VA, private insurance, et cetera, can be radically different depending on the patient population in question and their insurance dynamics. Next, will my product be eligible for a line item reimbursement? That is, you buy X, you get paid Y with some code intermediating the process, or is it part of some bundle of service, with the latter here in the US becoming ever more common with every passing year? If it's covered by insurance, will deductibles or copays be a barrier for patients? Deductibles and copays have been steadily going up to the point that it's a significant part of the fulfillment decision of the patient deciding, the doctor says I should get this, but do I? And if it's not covered, and many medical products actually aren't covered by insurance, will the patients be willing and able to pay for the product themselves? And then finally, to Don's point about there's always competition and or alternatives. How does the use of my product compare to whatever treatment modalities or diagnostic modalities are currently being used in terms of mortality, morbidity, or consumption of other healthcare resources, all of which is exactly what Renée is going to talk to us about next.
Text, Health Economics.
Great, thanks, Luis.
Text, Misunderstanding the misalignment in economic incentives for payers, providers, and patients, silos rather than entire cost of an episode of care.
So you've seen that this has been a common theme amongst the two so far, and I'm going to echo my colleagues that one of the common mistakes is misunderstanding the misalignments in economic incentives for the different stakeholders. So for example, we don't have a single payer. This isn't a nationalized system like in the UK, for example. So if you had an episode of care, might be an acute exacerbation of asthma. The patient goes into the hospital, the payers, the providers, and the patients may have different economic incentives. Unlike a single payer where they're just looking to make sure that the patient is doing well and gets out of the hospital in as good a shape as possible. The patients want to get out and feel well and have a good quality of life. The payers want that episode of care to be done with and not have the patient come back in again, because in the US, they don't get paid for that second time within 30 days. And the providers definitely want to be reimbursed.
Text, Not knowing who the consumers are for your health economic evidence.
So the second pitfall, again, common theme, and again, who the consumers are for your health economic evidence. And that's the idea of health economics. You are creating evidence that will allow the technology to be reimbursed. As Don mentioned, the overarching theme here would be the next bullet, waiting until product launch to think about collecting evidence to support reimbursement. Unlike the hockey stick, oh, we're FDA approved. Now, as Luis said, no, everybody's going to reimburse, everybody's going to pay, and we're going to get all of this money. No, it doesn't really work that way, or not necessarily, unless you have some kind of a breakthrough. And even then, if it's very expensive, people might think twice about it. So it's a good idea to start thinking about collecting this evidence that you're going to use to show, to give an economic picture and to show that your technology is cost effective or cost saving or even worth reimbursing in phase 2, definitely by phase 3. You don't want to wait until your board of directors or your investors say, so how are you going to get this paid for once it's been approved? No, that's a little late.
Not taking into account or collecting the variables required for a cost-effectiveness analysis.
And so, as we said, you're not taking these things into account to show a cost-effectiveness story. It's really important to weigh in on and to collect this information at the very least while you're doing your RCTs. Don't wait until the end. Don't wait until after patients have already been consented. And then you go, oh, we'd like to collect resource use from patient bills. Well, you didn't include that in your patient consent. So you can't do that. So you're either going to have to go back and reconsent them, which isn't a lot of fun, especially if it's a large RCT, or you're not going to get that information.
Not considering label requirements using health economics and outcomes research claims.
And then lastly, also not taking into consideration how you want to be able to use this evidence, especially in areas such as oncology. You can actually have label indications in your label that are specific to health economics and outcomes research. So for example, quality of life can be a claim in and of itself, but you have to use the right instruments and you do it according to a proper FDA protocol so that you can use that information for your label. So we look forward to speaking about all of these things more in the workshops, and I turn it over to Monique.
Thank you very much. We just wanted to remind you of our Entrepreneur Workshop series. We are going to rechat that link if you want to get the next one on your calendar, which is March 16th, Corporate Governance and Management, and look out for upcoming registration opportunities for April 27th and June 22nd.
Connect with NIA. Visit nia.hih.gov/SBIR. Follow us on Twitter at NIA_SBIR. Follow us on LinkedIn at NIA Office of Small Business Research. View upcoming events and funding opportunities. Join our mailing list. Questions? Email niasmallbusiness@mail.nih.gov.
We want to be able to connect with you and be accessible, and so please feel free to send us an email. We also invite you to join our community on Twitter, LinkedIn, and you can also join our mailing list. And this is for the National Institute on Aging, and we have a similar list for NHLBI. We will chat these links out to you so you have them as well.
Connect with NHLBI. Visit bit.ly/3p5NUYK. Follow us on Twitter at NHLBI_SBIR. Follow us on LinkedIn, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. Questions? Email NHLBI_SBIR@mail.nih.gov.